The howling wind whipped dust across the desolate trail as Bethany Valois clutched her torn dress and stared at the retreating figures of the bandits who had just stolen everything she owned. The year was 1875, and she was stranded in the unforgiving terrain of western Colorado, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small locket containing her mother's portrait. Bethany had been traveling from Boston to Valentine, Colorado, to take a position as the new schoolteacher. After the death of her parents, she had decided that a fresh start in the West might heal her wounded heart. Now, as the stagecoach disappeared over the horizon, the driver and guard having been shot dead during the robbery, she wondered if she had made a fatal mistake. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and purple. Bethany's throat tightened with fear as she realized she would soon be alone in the darkness. The nearest town was still a day's journey away, and she had no water, no food, and no means of protection against the wild animals that roamed these parts. As she contemplated her bleak situation, the sound of hoofbeats broke through her panic. Instinctively, she ducked behind a large boulder, fearing the return of the bandits. Peering cautiously around the rock, she saw a lone rider approaching. The man rode tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. He wore a weather-beaten hat pulled low over his eyes, and a bandana covered the lower half of his face to protect against the dust. As he drew closer, he slowed his horse and tipped his hat back, revealing a face weathered by the elements but with eyes as blue as the Colorado sky. "Madam," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the distance, "are you all right?" Bethany hesitated, unsure if she could trust this stranger. But with no other options, she slowly emerged from her hiding place. "I was on the stagecoach," she explained, her voice quavering. "It was robbed. The driver and guard, they're dead. The bandits took everything, even the horses." The cowboy surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing at the tracks in the dirt. "The Reeves gang," he said grimly. "They've been causing trouble all over these parts." He dismounted and approached her slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Name's Gabriel Mackenzie," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Most folks just call me Gabe." "Bethany Valois," she replied, trying to keep her dignity despite her disheveled appearance. Gabe looked at the sky, then back at the empty trail. "Night's coming fast, and we're miles from Valentine. My cabin's not far from here, just over that ridge. You'd be welcome to take shelter there until I can get you to town safely." Bethany felt a flutter of apprehension. Her mother had always warned her about the dangers of trusting strangers, especially men. But as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky and a distant howl echoed across the plains, she realized she had little choice. "Thank you, Mr. Mackenzie," she said formally. "I would be most grateful for your assistance." Gabe nodded and offered her his canteen. "Drink," he said. "You look parched." The water was warm, but felt like heaven against her dry throat. As she drank, Gabe whistled to his horse, a magnificent palomino that trotted over obediently. "This is Sundance," he said, patting the horse's neck. "He's strong enough to carry us both back to my place." He extended a hand to her. "May I?" Bethany nodded, and Gabe lifted her onto Sundance's back with surprising gentleness for such a rugged-looking man. He mounted behind her, keeping a respectful distance as he reached around her for the reins. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he instructed, and then they were moving, the rhythmic sway of the horse's gait strangely comforting. As they rode, the last light faded from the sky, leaving only a canvas of stars above them. Bethany had never seen so many stars in Boston, where the city lights dimmed their brilliance. Despite her ordeal, she couldn't help but be awed by the sheer beauty of the untamed wilderness. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "That it is," Gabe agreed. "Most beautiful country in the world, if you ask me. Of course, it can kill you just as easy as it can take your breath away." "I'm learning that lesson rather quickly," Bethany said with a hint of wry humor, surprising herself. Gabe chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. "You've got spirit, Miss Valois. That'll serve you well out here." They crested a ridge, and below them, nestled in a small clearing beside a creek, was a cabin. It was simple but well built, with a small corral to one side and wisps of smoke still rising from the chimney. "Home sweet home," Gabe said, guiding Sundance down the slope. As they approached, a dog came bounding out to greet them, its bark echoing in the quiet night. "That's Rusty," Gabe explained. "Don't worry, he's friendly, just protective." Bethany tensed as the large brown dog circled the horse, but true to Gabe's word, once Rusty caught her scent, he merely wagged his tail and led the way to the cabin. Gabe dismounted first, then reached up to help Bethany down. Her legs were stiff from the ride and the shock of the day's events, and she stumbled slightly, her hands instinctively catching onto Gabe's arms. She was immediately aware of the solid strength in those arms, and a strange fluttering sensation took root in her stomach. "Careful now," he said softly, steadying her. "Thank you," she murmured, quickly releasing her grip and stepping back. Gabe led Sundance to the corral, removing the saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency. He pumped water into a trough and made sure the horse was comfortable before turning his attention back to Bethany. "Let's get you inside and warmed up," he said, guiding her to the cabin door. The interior was surprisingly cozy. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. A table and 2 chairs stood in one corner, a bed with a patchwork quilt in another, and a small kitchen area with a wood stove completed the single-room dwelling. Everything was neat and orderly, not at all what Bethany had expected from a bachelor's cabin. "Please sit," Gabe said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll stoke the fire and put on some coffee." Bethany sank gratefully into the chair, the events of the day catching up with her. She watched as Gabe moved around the cabin with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own space. He added wood to the fire, hung a kettle over the flames, and rummaged in a cupboard for cups and a tin of coffee. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I've got some stew I can heat up." "That would be lovely," Bethany replied, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since a brief stop at midday. As Gabe prepared the meal, Bethany found herself studying him. Without his hat, she could see that his dark hair was flecked with silver at the temples, though he didn't seem much older than 30. His movements were those of a man accustomed to hard work, but there was a grace to them as well. "How long have you lived here, Mr. Mackenzie?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 5 years now," he answered, spooning stew into a pot to heat. "And please call me Gabe. Mr. Mackenzie makes me feel like my pa." Bethany smiled despite herself. "Very well, Gabe. And you may call me Bethany, given the circumstances." He nodded, returning her smile, and Bethany noticed how it transformed his face, softening the hard lines etched by sun and wind. "What brings you to these parts, Bethany? Not many women travel alone through this territory." "I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Valentine," she explained. "Or I was before." She trailed off, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. "Everything I owned was in my trunk on that stagecoach. My clothes, my books, my teaching materials." Gabe set a steaming bowl of stew before her, along with a hunk of bread. "Valentine's had a hard time keeping a teacher," he said. "Last 3 have left within a month. Too rough for their liking." Bethany straightened her spine. "Well, I have no intention of being so easily discouraged. I made a commitment, and I intend to honor it." Gabe raised an eyebrow, seeming impressed by her determination. "The school board will be glad to hear it, though you might want to delay your arrival by a day or 2 until we can get you some necessities." The stew was simple but delicious, rich with chunks of venison and vegetables from Gabe's garden. Bethany hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. "Are you a rancher, Gabe?" she asked, curious about this man who lived alone in the wilderness, yet showed such unexpected kindness to a stranger. "Of a sort," he replied. "I've got a small herd of cattle, and I do some hunting and trapping. I work as a guide sometimes, too, for those fancy Eastern types who want to hunt elk or bear." There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "And I help the sheriff in Valentine from time to time, tracking outlaws." "Like the Reeves gang?" Bethany asked. A shadow crossed Gabe's face. "Exactly like them. Been trying to catch up to them for months now. They've hit 3 stagecoaches this season, not counting yours." Bethany shivered, remembering the cold eyes of the lead bandit as he had yanked her mother's locket from her neck, then tossed it back at her with a sneer when he realized it held no value. "I was lucky," she said softly. "They didn't hurt me." Gabe's hands tightened on his cup. "No, they wouldn't. Not James Reeves's style. He fancies himself a gentleman bandit. Doesn't mean he won't kill a man who resists, though." After they finished eating, Gabe insisted that Bethany take his bed while he slept on a bedroll by the fire. She protested, but he was firm. "I've spent more nights under the stars than I can count," he said. "One night on the floor won't kill me." Too exhausted to argue further, Bethany accepted his offer. Gabe provided her with one of his clean shirts to sleep in and turned his back politely while she changed behind a hanging blanket he had put up for privacy. The shirt was enormous on her slender frame, reaching almost to her knees, but it was soft from many washings and smelled of soap and pine, a comforting scent. The bed was more comfortable than she had expected, the mattress stuffed with fresh straw and topped with layers of soft hides and quilts. "Good night, Bethany," Gabe said, settling onto his bedroll. "Sleep well." "Good night, Gabe," she replied, "and thank you for everything." His only response was a soft grunt, but she could sense his smile in the darkness. Despite her exhaustion, Bethany lay awake for a while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of the wind through the trees, the occasional pop from the dying fire, and beneath it all, the steady breathing of the man who had saved her from a night alone in the wilderness. She wondered about him. What had brought him to this solitary existence? Had there ever been a woman in his life? There was a gentleness to him that spoke of good upbringing, yet he clearly belonged to this wild country in a way she doubted she ever could. Eventually, lulled by the rhythmic sound of Gabe's breathing and the comfort of being safe and warm, Bethany drifted into a deep sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, Bethany was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up with a start. Gabe was at the stove, his back to her, whistling softly as he tended to something in a cast-iron skillet. He was dressed in a fresh shirt, his hair damp as if he'd recently washed. "Morning," he said without turning. "Hope you're hungry." "I've made flapjacks and bacon." Bethany ran a hand through her tangled hair, suddenly self-conscious. "Good morning. Yes, that sounds wonderful. Is there somewhere I could freshen up?" Gabe gestured to a basin of water he had set on a small table near the bed. "I've drawn some fresh water from the creek. There's soap and a towel there. I'll step outside while you get dressed." True to his word, he took his coffee and went out to the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Bethany hurried to wash her face and hands, then put on her dress from the day before. It was wrinkled and still bore the dust of the trail, but it was all she had. She did her best to comb her hair with her fingers and pinned it back with the few hairpins that had remained in place during the robbery. When she opened the door to signal that she was decent, Gabe returned with a bundle of clothing in his arms. "These belong to my sister," he explained, setting the bundle on the table. "She stayed with me for a spell last year before moving on to California with her husband. Left these behind, said they weren't fashionable enough for San Francisco." He grinned. "Might be a bit large for you, but they're clean, and the dress should do until we can get you to Valentine and find you something more suitable." Bethany was touched by his thoughtfulness. "Your sister must be a very practical woman." Melissa. Lord, no. She's as impractical as they come. But she knew better than to bring her fancy city clothes out here. These are her roughing-it clothes, as she called them. He chuckled at the memory. "I'll give you some privacy again." The dress was indeed a bit large, but it was well made and of good quality, a simple blue calico that was far more appropriate for frontier life than Bethany's own travel dress of fine wool. There were also undergarments, a shawl, and even a pair of sturdy boots that, miraculously, were only slightly too large for her feet when she stuffed the toes with some scraps of cloth. Dressed and feeling much more like herself, Bethany joined Gabe at the table, where he had laid out a breakfast fit for a lumberjack golden flapjacks, crispy bacon, and fresh eggs. "This looks magnificent," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Simple fare," he replied with a modest shrug, "but filling." As they ate, Gabe outlined his plan for the day. "We should reach Valentine by nightfall if we leave within the hour. I need to report the Stagecoach robbery to Sheriff Ellis anyway, and he'll want your account of what happened." Bethany nodded, though the thought of reliving the terrifying experience made her stomach clench. "Of course. And I must present myself to the school board and explain my circumstances." "Don't you worry about that," Gabe assured her. "Valentine might be rough around the edges, but folks there look out for each other. Once they hear what happened, they'll help you get settled." After breakfast, they prepared for the journey. Gabe packed provisions for the trip and saddled Sundance while Bethany tidied the cabin, feeling it was the least she could do to repay his kindness. "You didn't have to do that," Gabe said when he returned to find the dishes washed and the bed made. "I wanted to," Bethany replied simply. "You've been more than generous." A hint of color touched Gabe's cheeks, and he busied himself with checking his rifle before strapping it to his saddle. "We'd best get going. Got a fair piece to travel before dark." The day was clear and warm, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes one grateful to be alive. As they rode double on Sundance, Bethany found herself relaxing against Gabe's solid presence at her back. The landscape that had seemed so threatening the night before now revealed its stark beauty in the daylight rolling hills covered in golden grass, stands of aspen trees with leaves turning to flame, distant mountains capped with the first snows of the season. "It's magnificent," Bethany breathed, taking it all in. "That it is," Gabe agreed, "worth all the hardships just to wake up to this every morning." "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." Gabe was silent for a moment, and she feared she had offended him, but when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "I reckon every man gets lonely sometimes," he said, "but I've got Rusty for company, and I'm in Valentine often enough to catch up on gossip and share a drink with friends. Most days, I'm content with my own thoughts for company." "Most days?" Bethany couldn't help prompting. Gabe's chuckle rumbled through his chest. "You don't miss much, do you, Miss Valois? All right. There are days when I think it might be nice to have someone to share my life with, but finding a woman willing to live so far from town, with none of the comforts of civilization, that's a tall order." Bethany thought of the cozy cabin, the magnificent scenery, the simple but satisfying life Gabe had carved out for himself. "Perhaps not so tall as you might think," she murmured, more to herself than to him. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Around midday, they stopped by a clear stream to rest and eat some of the provisions Gabe had packed: jerky, hard bread, and dried apples. As they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, Bethany found herself studying Gabe's profile. In the dappled sunlight, she could see that his eyes weren't just blue, but a remarkable shade that reminded her of the summer sky reflected in the deepest part of the pond near her childhood home. There were lines at the corners of those eyes, evidence of years spent squinting against the sun and, she suspected, of laughter. "How did you come to live out here?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who had shown her such kindness. Gabe took a swig from his canteen before answering. "Came west after the war between the states, that is. Fought for the Union, saw things no man should see. When it was over, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania, to all those memories. Needed open spaces, room to breathe." He gestured at the vast landscape around them. "Found what I was looking for right here." "Were you always alone?" A shadow crossed his face. "No. Came out with my brother initially. We had plans to build a ranch together, raise horses." He paused, and Bethany sensed the pain beneath the simple words. Lost him to pneumonia that first winter. By then I'd fallen in love with this country, so I stayed. I'm sorry about your brother, Bethany said softly. Gabe nodded his acknowledgement of her sympathy. What about you? What brings a Boston lady to the wilds of Colorado? Bethany sighed, plucking a blade of grass and twisting it between her fingers. My parents died last winter influenza. I was teaching at a girls' school in Boston, but after they were gone, the city felt suffocating. Too many memories, as you said. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Valentine, it seemed like a sign. A fresh start, Gabe said, understanding in his voice. Exactly. Though I didn't anticipate quite such an eventful journey. Gabe's laugh was unexpected and delightful, transforming his face. Well, Miss Valois, you've certainly had a proper introduction to the West. From here on out, everything will seem tame by comparison. They continued their journey after the brief rest, the terrain gradually changing as they moved closer to Valentine. The open prairie gave way to more rugged country, with rocky outcroppings and deeper ravines. Gabe pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories about the land and its history, including tales of the Ute tribes who had lived there for generations before the white settlers arrived. They got a raw deal, he said, a note of regret in his voice. Pushed onto reservations, their hunting grounds taken. Can't say I'm proud of how that all played out. Bethany appreciated his honesty. Many men of her acquaintance in Boston spoke of the native peoples as savage obstacles to progress, but Gabe's view seemed more nuanced, more humane. As the sun began its descent, they crested a hill, and below them lay Valentine, a small but bustling town nestled in a valley beside the Eagle River. From their vantage point, Bethany could see a main street lined with wooden buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, and horses hitched outside what appeared to be a saloon. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and on the outskirts she could make out small farms and ranches. Welcome to Valentine, Gabe said, a note of pride in his voice. Population 327 as of last count. It's larger than I expected, Bethany admitted. She had envisioned something much smaller, more primitive. It's growing fast, Gabe explained. The railroad's coming through next year, and that'll change everything. Some folks are excited about the prospects for business. Others, he shrugged, others worry it'll bring more trouble than it's worth. And which camp do you fall into? Bethany asked. Gabe considered the question. I reckon change is inevitable. Best to prepare for it rather than fight it. But I hope Valentine can grow without losing what makes it special, the way folks look out for each other, the sense of community. As they rode down into the town, people called out greetings to Gabe. He was clearly well-known and well-liked, tipping his hat to ladies and exchanging brief pleasantries with men they passed. Several curious glances were directed at Bethany, but the looks were more welcoming than suspicious. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, a small but solid building just off the main street. Sheriff Ellis turned out to be a tall, lean man with a drooping mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened gravely to their account of the Stagecoach robbery, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. Reeves' gang, sure enough, he said when they had finished. Getting bolder by the day. Killed the driver and guard, you say? He shook his head in disgust. That's new. Usually they just disarm them. They resisted, Bethany explained, her voice steady despite the painful memory. The guard managed to get off a shot before they killed him. Did he hit anyone? Sheriff Ellis asked eagerly. I think he might have, Bethany said, recalling the events. One of the bandits clutched his arm afterward, and the leader, Reeves, I suppose, seemed angry about it. That's something, at least, the sheriff said. Wounded man's easier to track. He turned to Gabe. You available to help with a posse, Mackenzie? Could use your tracking skills. Gabe glanced at Bethany, seeming torn. I need to see Miss Valois settled first. She's the new schoolteacher. The sheriff's expression softened. Of course, of course. Terrible way to arrive in our town, Miss Valois. Rest assured, we'll do everything possible to recover your belongings and bring those outlaws to justice. Thank you, Sheriff, Bethany said, though she held little hope of seeing her possessions again. Their next stop was the school board chairman's home. Mr. Hollister was a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and a booming voice that seemed at odds with his profession as the town's pharmacist. His wife, a tiny woman with bright eyes and a kind smile, immediately took Bethany under her wing. "You poor dear," Mrs. Hollister exclaimed after hearing their story. "Robbed and left for dead on your very first day in Colorado. Well, we'll soon set things right. You'll stay with us until you're properly settled in the teacherage." "The teacherage?" Bethany inquired. "The small house next to the schoolhouse," Mr. Hollister explained. "It's provided for the teacher's use. Nothing fancy, mind you, but comfortable enough. 2 rooms downstairs, 1 up, with a decent stove and a pump right in the kitchen." "That sounds wonderful," Bethany said sincerely. After fearing she might have to turn right around and go back east, the prospect of her own home and the teaching position still being available was an enormous relief. "School's set to start next Monday," Mr. Hollister continued. "Gives you a few days to get settled and prepare. We've got about 30 children enrolled, ages 6 to 16. Some only come when they can be spared from farm work, mind you." Gabe, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Miss Valois lost all her belongings in the robbery. She'll need some assistance getting started." Mr. Hollister waved a hand dismissively. "Not to worry. The town has a fund for the school. We can advance you some money for necessities, Miss Valois, to be repaid from your salary over time. And I'm sure the ladies of the town will be happy to contribute clothing and household items to get you started." "That's very generous," Bethany said, touched by the offer. "Not at all," Mrs. Hollister insisted. "We're just glad to have you here. The children have been without proper schooling for months now." As the conversation continued, Bethany noticed Gabe becoming increasingly quiet. When Mr. Hollister invited them both to stay for supper, Gabe politely declined. "I should check in with the livery about my horse and see about joining that posse," he explained. "If you're settled here, Miss Valois." Though she understood his reasons, Bethany felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "Of course, I can't thank you enough for your help, Mr. Mackenzie." The formality between them felt strange after the intimacy of their journey, but with the Hollisters watching, it seemed appropriate. Gabe tipped his hat to her, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "It was my pleasure, Miss Valois. I wish you all the best with your new position." And with that, he was gone, leaving Bethany with an odd feeling of loss. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Bethany settled into her new life in Valentine. True to their word, the townspeople were incredibly generous. Women arrived at the Hollisters' home with clothing, linens, and kitchenware for her new home. Mr. Hollister advanced her enough money to purchase a few books and basic supplies for the school, and the local carpenter made repairs to the teacherage, which had stood empty for several months. By Saturday, Bethany was able to move into her new home. It was indeed small, but well-built and clean, after Mrs. Hollister organized a group of ladies to give it a thorough scrubbing. The furnishings were simple: a bed, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and a small desk for her work. But it felt like a palace to Bethany after the uncertainty of her arrival. Through it all, she found herself watching for Gabe, but there was no sign of him. She learned from town gossip that he had indeed joined the posse tracking the Reeves gang, along with Sheriff Ellis and several other men. The posse had been gone for 3 days now, and people were beginning to worry. On Sunday morning, Bethany attended services at the small white church on the edge of town. It was there that she first heard the rumors the posse had engaged in a shootout with the Reeves gang in a canyon about 20 miles from Valentine. Several men had been wounded, possibly killed. Her heart in her throat, Bethany approached the minister after the service. "Reverend Taylor, is it true about the posse? Have they been hurt?" The Reverend, a young man with earnest eyes, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We don't know for certain, Miss Valois. A prospector came in late last night with the news, but he didn't have details. Sheriff Ellis's deputy has gone to investigate." Bethany spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious anticipation, unable to focus on her lesson preparations for the coming week. Though she had known Gabe for only a short time, the thought that he might be injured or worse was unbearable. It wasn't until evening, as she sat on the small porch of the teacherage watching the sunset, that she heard the commotion in town. Horses' hooves, men's voices, calls for the doctor. The posse had returned. Without pausing to grab a shawl, Bethany hurried toward the main street. A crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office. Pushing her way through, she caught sight of Sheriff Ellis, his arm in a makeshift sling, directing several men who were carrying an unconscious form into the building. "Sheriff," she called out, "what happened? Is that Mr. Mackenzie?" Ellis turned, his face grim but softening slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Valois." "Yes, that's Gabe. He took a bullet meant for me. Got the bastard who shot him, though pardon my language." "Will he be all right?" Bethany asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doc Harris is the best for 50 miles. If anyone can pull Gabe through, he can." The sheriff studied her face. "You two acquainted before all this?" "No," Bethany admitted, "but he saved my life after the Stagecoach robbery. I owe him a great deal." Ellis nodded in understanding. "That sounds like Gabe. Always helping folks, never asking for anything in return." He glanced toward the doctor's office. "I'd best go see how he's doing. I'll let you know when there's news." Bethany returned to her small house, but sleep eluded her. She kept seeing Gabe's face, hearing his laugh, feeling the solid warmth of his presence as they rode together. It made no sense to feel such attachment to a man she had known for so short a time, yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt. Morning brought no news, and Bethany forced herself to focus on her first day of school. The children were a lively bunch, curious about their new teacher and full of energy. By midday, she had learned all 30 names, established the first rules of the classroom, and assigned reading lessons appropriate to each child's level. It was exhausting but exhilarating work, exactly what she had hoped for when she accepted the position. As the children filed out at the end of the day, Mrs. Hollister appeared at the schoolhouse door. "Miss Valois, I thought you might like to know that Gabriel Mackenzie is awake and asking for you." Bethany's heart leapt, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollister. I'll go see him as soon as I've tidied up here." The older woman's eyes twinkled knowingly. "No need to wait. I can finish up here. You go on now." Gathering her shawl, Bethany made her way to Dr. Harris's office, trying not to hurry too obviously. The doctor, a gruff man with kind eyes, met her at the door. "He's weak but stable," Dr. Harris informed her. "Bullet went clean through his shoulder, missed anything vital. He'll have a sore arm for a while, but with proper care, he should make a full recovery." "May I see him?" Bethany asked. "Briefly. He needs rest more than company, but he's been asking for you since he woke up." The doctor led her to a small back room where Gabe lay on a narrow bed, his face pale against the white pillow, his shoulder heavily bandaged. His eyes were closed, and Bethany thought he might be asleep, but they opened as she approached. "Miss Valois," he said, his voice weak but warm. "You came." "Of course I came," she replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I was worried when I heard about the shootout." A faint smile touched his lips. "Did we get them?" "My memory's a bit foggy." "According to Sheriff Ellis, you got at least one of them, the one who shot you. But James Reeves and several others escaped." Gabe frowned. "Damn. Sorry, pardon my language. I've heard worse in Boston drawing rooms," Bethany assured him with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule. But Doc says I'll live." His eyes held hers. "How's school? The children treating you well?" Bethany was touched that he would think of her work while lying injured. "It was my first day today, and it went surprisingly well. They're good children, eager to learn." "Glad to hear it. Valentine needs a good teacher." There was an awkward pause, as if neither quite knew what to say next. Finally, Bethany spoke. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life, Mr. Mackenzie." "Gabe," he corrected, "and there's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "I don't believe that's true," Bethany said softly. "Not everyone would have been so kind, so gentle." A touch of color returned to Gabe's pale cheeks. Well, you made it easy. Some women would have been hysterical after what you went through. I've never found hysteria particularly useful, Bethany said dryly, and was rewarded with a chuckle from Gabe that turned into a grimace of pain. Don't make me laugh, he groaned. It hurts like the dickens. Dr. Harris appeared in the doorway. That's enough visiting for today, Miss Valois. My patient needs rest. Bethany rose, reluctant to leave but understanding the necessity. I'll come back tomorrow if that's all right. I'd like that, Gabe said, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion. Bethany visited Gabe every day after school for the next week. As his strength returned, their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his dreams for his small ranch, his hopes of one day breeding horses rather than cattle. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston, her love of teaching, and her passion for literature. I never had much schooling, Gabe admitted one afternoon as he sat propped up in bed, looking markedly better than he had days before. Learned to read and cipher, enough to get by, but books weren't a priority in our house. It's never too late to discover the joy of reading, Bethany said, an idea forming. Would you like me to bring you a book? Something to pass the time while you recover? Gabe looked uncertain. I'm not sure I'd understand those fancy novels you probably like. Let me choose something for you, she insisted. If you don't enjoy it, there's no obligation to finish it. The next day, she brought him a copy of The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. It's an adventure story set during the French and Indian War, she explained. I thought you might enjoy it, given your appreciation for the native peoples here. Gabe accepted the book with careful hands, as if it were a precious object. I'll give it a try, he promised. To Bethany's delight, he took to the story with unexpected enthusiasm. When she visited 2 days later, he was halfway through the book. It's not an easy read, he admitted. Some of the words I have to puzzle out, but the story, it pulls you in. That's the magic of a good book, Bethany said, unable to hide her pleasure at his interest. It transports you to another time and place. As October gave way to November, Gabe continued to recover. Dr. Harris finally declared him well enough to return home, though he would need to avoid strenuous work for several more weeks. The problem is getting him home, Dr. Harris told Bethany when she visited after school. His cabin's a fair distance, and he's still weak. Sheriff Ellis offered to have one of his deputies take him, but all the men are busy with that bank robbery over in Eagle. Bethany made a decision on the spot. I could take him, she offered. School's out for the weekend tomorrow afternoon. I could borrow a wagon and drive him home, make sure he's settled properly. Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. That's a generous offer, Miss Valois, but it would mean spending at least one night on the trail. Are you certain it would be appropriate? Bethany lifted her chin. Mr. Mackenzie saved my life, Doctor. I believe I can weather a bit of gossip to return the favor. And so it was arranged. Mr. Hollister lent her his wagon and team. Mrs. Hollister packed a basket of food and medical supplies, and by Friday afternoon, Bethany was helping Gabe into the wagon, his arm still in a sling but his color much improved. You don't have to do this, he protested as she arranged blankets around him for the journey. I could wait for one of the deputies. Nonsense, Bethany said firmly. The sooner you're home, the sooner you'll fully recover. Besides, I'm curious to see your cabin again in daylight. The journey was slower than their ride into Valentine had been. The wagon jolted over the rutted trail, and Bethany could see Gabe wincing occasionally despite his efforts to hide his discomfort. They made camp earlier than planned in a sheltered hollow beside a small creek. As Bethany prepared a simple meal over the campfire, Gabe watched her with a mixture of admiration and amusement. You're full of surprises, Miss Valois, he said. Most Eastern ladies I've met would faint at the thought of sleeping outdoors. Bethany laughed as she stirred the pot of beans and bacon. I may have been raised in Boston, but my father believed in practical education. He taught me how to build a fire, catch a fish, and find my way by the stars. Sounds like a remarkable man, Gabe observed. He was, Bethany said softly, a pang of grief momentarily shadowing her face. I miss him every day. They ate their meal as the stars appeared overhead, exchanging stories and companionable silence in equal measure. As the fire burned low, Bethany set up her bedroll on one side of the fire, Gabe's on the other. I've been thinking, Gabe said as they prepared to sleep, about what happens when we reach my cabin. Bethany paused in arranging her blankets. What do you mean? Well, I'm not exactly in a condition to fend for myself yet. Can't chop wood one-handed or haul water or do much of anything useful. I thought perhaps one of your neighbors might help, Bethany suggested. Gabe chuckled. My nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and he's 70 if he's a day. Not much help for chores. Oh, Bethany hadn't considered this. What will you do? Gabe looked uncomfortable. I was hoping. That is, would you consider staying on for a day or two, just until I can manage the basics? I know it's a lot to ask, and there'd be talk in town, but... Yes, Bethany interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'll stay and help you get settled. School doesn't resume until Monday, so I have the weekend. And as for the talk, she shrugged. People will always talk. I'd rather give them something interesting to discuss than worry about their opinions. Gabe's smile was worth any amount of gossip. Thank you, Bethany. I promise I'll make it up to you somehow. They reached Gabe's cabin the following day around noon. Rusty the dog came bounding out to greet them, nearly knocking Gabe over in his enthusiasm. Easy boy, Gabe laughed, scratching the dog's ears with his good hand. Yes, I missed you too. The cabin looked much as Bethany remembered it, though seeing it in daylight revealed both its simplicity and its charm. The log walls were solid and well chinked against the winter cold. The small garden beside the cabin had been harvested, but was neatly prepared for spring planting, and the view from the front porch stretched for miles across the rolling landscape. It's beautiful, Bethany said, taking in the panorama. Home sweet home, Gabe agreed, his voice warm with affection for the place. The next day and a half passed in a comfortable routine as Bethany helped Gabe settle back into his home. She chopped firewood, a skill her father had indeed taught her, though she was out of practice, fetched water from the creek, and prepared meals from Gabe's stores of dried and preserved food. In the evenings they sat by the fire, Bethany reading aloud from The Last of the Mohicans, while Gabe listened, occasionally asking questions about the story or the vocabulary. On Sunday afternoon, as the time for her departure approached, a melancholy settled over both of them. Bethany was packing the few belongings she had brought when Gabe cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he said, his voice unusually hesitant, about what happens next. Bethany turned to face him. What do you mean? Well, I'll be stuck here for a few more weeks at least, unable to ride into town, and you'll be busy with the school. He trailed off, seeming unsure how to continue. Are you worried about managing on your own? Bethany asked. Because I could arrange to come back next weekend, perhaps bring more supplies. No, Gabe interrupted, then immediately softened his tone. That is, yes, I would welcome your visit, but that's not what I meant. He took a deep breath. Bethany, I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel a connection with you that I've never experienced before, and I was wondering if you might feel something similar. Bethany's heart raced as she realized what he was saying. Gabe, she said softly, are you courting me? A flush crept up his neck, but he met her eyes squarely. I reckon I am, if you're amenable. Though I know I'm not much of a catch, a rough frontiersman with a small ranch miles from nowhere. Bethany closed the distance between them, placing her hand gently on his uninjured arm. I think you underestimate yourself, Gabriel Mackenzie. You're a kind, intelligent, honorable man. Any woman would be fortunate to have your attention. And you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do you feel about it? Instead of answering with words, Bethany rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but the spark it ignited between them was undeniable. Does that answer your question? she murmured as she pulled back, her cheeks flushed. Gabe's smile was radiant. It's a start. He reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her skin. But I think I need a bit more clarity. This time, he initiated the kiss, and there was nothing chaste about it. His lips moved against hers with a tenderness that belied his strength, and Bethany found herself responding with a passion she hadn't known she possessed. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "Well," Gabe said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'd say we have an understanding." "I'd say we do," Bethany agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The winter of 1875-76 brought heavy snows to Colorado, making travel between Valentine and Gabe's cabin difficult but not impossible. Their courtship progressed through weekend visits and the occasional evening when Gabe would ride into town for supplies and stay for supper at Bethany's teacherage, always with Mrs. Hollister or another respectable matron present as chaperone. The town watched their romance unfold with varying degrees of interest and approval. Some, like the Hollisters, were delighted to see the new schoolteacher finding happiness with a man they respected. Others were more skeptical, wondering how a refined Boston lady could possibly be content with the isolated life Gabe offered. Bethany paid little attention to the gossip. She was too busy discovering the joy of being in love with a man who respected her mind as much as he desired her body, who listened when she spoke and valued her opinions, who showed her the beauty of the wilderness through his eyes. Gabe, for his part, continued his education under Bethany's guidance, developing a genuine love of reading that surprised them both. He brought her small gifts when he visited an intricately carved wooden box he had made during the long winter evenings, wildflowers gathered on the trail, once even a fox kit he had rescued whose mother had been killed by a mountain lion. "What am I supposed to do with a wild fox?" Bethany had exclaimed, even as she fell in love with the tiny creature. "Raise him," Gabe said simply. "He needs someone to care for him, and I thought of you immediately." The fox, which she named Russet, became a beloved pet and a fixture in the schoolroom, to the delight of the children. It was just one of many ways in which Gabe showed his understanding of her character, his appreciation for her love of all living things. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it wildflowers and birdsong, they had discussed marriage but made no formal plans. Gabe wanted to add a room to his cabin and make other improvements before asking Bethany to share his home permanently. "I want you to have a proper place," he explained as they walked along the banks of the Eagle River one mild April evening. "Not just a bachelor's shack." "The cabin is lovely as it is," Bethany assured him, though she appreciated his consideration. "It needs a proper kitchen," Gabe insisted, "and bookshelves for all those books you've been collecting, and maybe a small garden just for flowers, not just vegetables." Bethany squeezed his hand, touched by his thoughtfulness. "All that can come in time, Gabe. What matters to me is being with you." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Then marry me, Bethany Valois. Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you've made me." Tears of joy sprang to Bethany's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. They were married in the small church in Valentine on a perfect June day, with wildflowers decorating the altar and every resident of the town in attendance. Bethany wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Hollister and several other ladies had helped her make, with lace sent from her aunt in Boston as a wedding gift. Gabe, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Mr. Hollister's arm. The school board granted Bethany permission to finish the term, but accepted her resignation effective immediately afterward. "A married woman's place is with her husband," Mr. Hollister had said when she broached the subject of possibly continuing to teach. Though she felt a pang at giving up her profession, Bethany understood the conventions of the time and was eager to begin her life with Gabe. True to his word, Gabe had worked tirelessly through the spring to improve the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as their bedroom, expanding the kitchen area, and building floor-to-ceiling bookshelves along one wall of the main room. He had even planted a small flower garden beside the porch with seeds ordered specially from Denver. Their wedding night was a revelation for Bethany. Though she had been raised with the typical Victorian notions of wifely duty, Gabe's tender attentions transformed what might have been merely an obligation into a joyous consummation of their love. His hands, capable of such strength in his daily work, were gentle as they explored her body, and his patience as he guided her through her first experience of physical love endeared him to her even more. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered afterward, curled against his side in their new bed. "Like what?" Gabe murmured, stroking her hair. "So beautiful, so right." His chuckle rumbled through his chest beneath her ear. "That's because we're meant to be together, Bethany Mackenzie, two halves of a whole." Life as a rancher's wife brought challenges Bethany hadn't anticipated, despite her preparation. The isolation was sometimes difficult for a woman who had grown up in a bustling city. The physical labor was demanding, especially during the harsh winters when simply keeping the cabin warm required constant attention. And there were moments of danger, a mountain lion that ventured too close to the corral, a flash flood that nearly washed away their garden, a lightning-sparked fire that threatened the western pasture. But there were joys she hadn't anticipated either. The magnificent sunrises that greeted her each morning, the satisfaction of preserving the summer's bounty for winter use, the quiet evenings by the fire with Gabe, reading aloud or simply talking about their day, the deep sense of connection to the land and the seasons, and most of all, the growing bond with her husband, a love that seemed to deepen with each passing day. In the spring of 1877, Bethany discovered she was expecting their first child. Gabe's reaction was everything she had hoped for: joy, excitement, and a touching concern for her well-being. "We should move into town until after the baby comes," he suggested, worry creasing his brow. "Be closer to the doctor." But Bethany was firm. "Women have been having babies in remote cabins since the beginning of time," she said. "Besides, Mrs. Ellis was a midwife before she married the sheriff. She's promised to come stay with us when my time approaches." Their son, William Thomas Mackenzie, was born on a crisp October morning with Mrs. Ellis in attendance and Gabe pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. The moment Bethany placed their tiny son in his father's arms, she knew that all the hardships of frontier life were worth it for this, the sight of her strong, capable husband cradling their child with tears of joy streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," Gabe whispered, touching a finger to the baby's tiny hand, just like his mother. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Elizabeth Grace, joined them 2 years after William. 3 years later came another son, James Henry. Each birth strengthened the bond between Bethany and Gabe, each child adding a new dimension to their love. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Gabe's dream of breeding horses came to fruition, his stock becoming known throughout the region for their strength and intelligence. Bethany put her education to use, keeping the books for the growing business and teaching their children until they were old enough to attend the school in Valentine, which by then had grown into a proper town with the arrival of the railroad. There were sorrows along the way, a harsh winter that claimed several of their best horses, a bout of scarlet fever that nearly took Elizabeth, the news that Gabe's sister Melissa had died in the San Francisco earthquake of 1887. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership weathering every storm. In 1895, 20 years after their first meeting, Gabe and Bethany stood on the porch of their expanded home, no longer a simple cabin, but a comfortable ranch house with a wide veranda and large windows that captured the magnificent views. William, now a strapping young man of 18, was preparing to attend college in Denver, the first Mackenzie to pursue higher education. Elizabeth, 16 and as beautiful as her mother had been at that age, was helping to train the yearling colts, showing a natural affinity for horses. And James, 13 and full of mischief, was the spitting image of his father in his younger days. "Did you ever imagine this?" Bethany asked, leaning against Gabe's shoulder as they watched the sun set over the land they had nurtured together. "What's that?" Gabe asked, his arm tightening around her waist. "This life. This happiness. That day when you found me by the side of the trail. Did you ever imagine we'd build all this together?" Gabe was quiet for a moment, considering. "I knew you were special," he finally said. "I knew I wanted to know you better. But this?" He gestured at their home, their children, the prosperous ranch spread out before them. "This exceeded even my wildest dreams." "Mine too," Bethany admitted. "When I left Boston, I was looking for a new beginning, but I never imagined finding a love like ours." Gabe turned to face her, his hands framing her face with the same gentleness he had shown on their wedding night. Though lines now creased the corners of his eyes and silver threaded through his dark hair, to Bethany he was as handsome as the day they met. "I thank God every day for sending those bandits," Gabe said, a twinkle in his eye despite the serious tone of his voice. "If they hadn't robbed your stagecoach, I might never have found you." "Gabriel Mackenzie!" Bethany exclaimed in mock outrage. "That's a terrible thing to say." "But true," he insisted, leaning down to kiss her. "Everything good in my life began the moment I rode up that trail and said, 'My cabin's not far.'" As their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together, Bethany silently agreed. From the darkest moment of her life alone, afraid, stripped of everything she owned, had come the greatest blessing she could have imagined: a family, a home, and a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they turned to go inside, hand in hand, to the warmth and love of the home they had built together. The little fox, Russet, now elderly and gray-muzzled, padded after them, a living reminder of their early days together. Inside, lamps glowed in the windows, and their children's laughter echoed through the rooms, the perfect harmony of a life well lived and a love that had conquered every obstacle. Beginning with a chance encounter on a lonely Colorado trail,